Hey, it's David from Redneck Garage. I have my apron on because we're going to do some polishing today. Okay, I'm just kidding. I'm going to go through some techniques of polishing, some do's and don'ts, tools and equipment that you could use. So that's going to be kind of the, we had a request from this, so I'm going to do that. Let's talk about buffing for a minute. In regards to, say, a project like the YJ project where we're going to repaint the truck, basically you're going to lay down a thin base coat of color. And I say thin because in relation to the clear coat that you put on top of it is really pretty thin. Alright, so you're going to lay that down and you're going to put extra clear coat on. You're spraying extra coat on. And clear coat's pretty expensive. You'll see why I say that in a minute. So you lay on extra coats of clear, and then at the end of that, after it's cured out and dried enough, you'll take 1500 or 2000 grit sandpaper and you'll wet sand the whole vehicle down, and it'll be like a dull finish. You're sanding off some of that clear, but with a really fine sandpaper. Okay, then once that's done, once you've got it completely smoothed out, then you're going to take your buffing equipment, your polishing compound, and your buffer, and you're going to buff that out to a mirror-like finish. Awesome. Now, when you look at a new vehicle, or a vehicle that's been through a factory paint, they don't do that. In a factory setting, basically they have what's called an electrostatic painting. They put a negative charge on the vehicle, and they have robotic painting arms that paint the vehicle. They're able to control it very well with that. They control cost, they control material, they control thickness. Everything's down to factory specifications. Not like you're painting it in a driveway where you're going to lay down a bunch of extra clears so you can sand it off and then buff it out. Why do I say that? Okay, so now the question comes in. I've had a couple of requests on the channel. I want to buff my truck. Well, here's the danger in that sometimes. So don't blame me if I tell you how to buff a vehicle and you go back and you burn through your paint. Because that paint's 15, 20 years old, sometimes it's not that thick. Some paint aren't clear coat finishes. Sometimes they're just a solid finish. That's cool. But say you've got some damage to the clear coat paint itself, you're not going to be able to buff that out. If it's been buffed a couple times in the past, guess what? You're going to buff it out and take off more material. Buffing is really a very fine grit in the polishing material. When you squirt it on there, it's got very fine grit in it, so you're still going to take a little bit of material off while you're buffing that off. So if your paint's already thin, or I'll tell you where it's really bad is when you get to a corner, your buffer is going to have a tendency to put more pressure right there on that curve if you're not super careful, and you'll burn that clear coat off. Well, then all you've got is that base coat, or even underneath that, it'll knock the base coat off too. So you've got to be really super careful. If you got a paint job that's in need of buffing, usually that means it needs to be repainted. You can try it, but if you burn through and you damage that paint, then you're going to be repainting it anyway. So that's kind of the thought process on the buffing process in itself. So let's take a minute and talk about the tools that you're going to need for buffing. Obviously, we're not a body shop, we're a redneck garage. You don't need to spend $1 million to be able to get buffing equipment to buff the vehicle out. One of the things I really like, this is a pretty handy dandy thing, even we talked about earlier about wet sanding the car. This is a number 20 wetter sponge pad. I find these work really well when you're wet sanding. If you do a 1500 or 2000 grit on a new finish and you get it down to a very smooth finish, I take this and rub it across the finish and squeegee it off, and you can see that it's a dull flat finish, or you can see imperfections in it. The water is going to make it harder to see imperfections, so if you squeegee that off, it'll get that material off, and it'll also let you see the finish as you're wet sanding. Okay, so say we're done with the wet sanding. One of the things that you're going to need is this. Okay, looks like a grinder, right? Okay, so the difference between this, which is a sander polisher, a buffer polisher, I'm sorry, and a grinder is what? Well, it's 3,000 RPM difference. These will usually go anywhere from 3,000 to 3,500 RPM, and they have a variable speed when you press the button. A grinder is just going to be about 6,000 RPM, and it's just on off. So you've got a higher tendency to burn through paint if you're using a grinder. Now the ends, you can put this on a grinder end, but that extra RPMs is going to make it way more dangerous as far as trying to buff something out, because you build up a lot of heat and you burn through paint. You can make a real mess of it. Now, as far as where to get a buffer, this one I've had for, I don't know, 6-7 years, and I bought this at Harbor Freight Tools for probably 49 bucks. It's super cheap. It was super cheap. Now I may have to replace it soon because I've really worn it out. But you don't need to go buy a $250 Makita grinder or any other name brand thing. This one has worked great. Now, as far as your buffing materials and your wheels and everything, I bought this. I prefer the Velcro pads. Now this is a foam pad, and they make different foam pads depending on how much aggressiveness you want when you're buffing the truck. I haven't seen that much difference between the different colors. There's a black one and a foam one. I've found that the buffing compound that you use makes a lot bigger difference than the type of wheel that you use. So you're going to put this on your buffer, and you're going to use it with your buffing compound to go over the sanded parts. Now, if you've got an existing finish and you want to try buffing your truck, you wouldn't use the sandpaper part of it. You would just go ahead and straight on rub the buffing compound. If it's an existing older truck, I would go with a very, very fine compound rather than one that's more aggressive. You want to take off as little material as you can and still get a buff to it. Because it's Velcro, it's real quick to change this. And once you get it down to a pretty good sheen, you're going to switch over to like a lamb's wool, right? And this one's a Velcro too, and you just pop it on there, and then you're going to do your finishing buffing with a lamb's wool. But you won't use the lamb's wool for the original part. Nothing that big a deal about it. You got to be careful. You can see this has got tape all over it. Try to watch where your cord is, because let me tell you, this cord will get caught up in that thing and it'll yank it out of the wall, and it's a big mess. I had to splice this one back together. My $49 buffing wheel. This is compound polish. There's a bunch of different ones made. 3M makes it. This one happens to be TCP Global's Custom Shop brand. You can read when you're buying it. This goes a long, long way. You can feel when you put it between your fingers that it's a very, very fine grit to it. Super fine grit. And I found these work fairly well for what I use it for. Then on top of that, there's a finishing compound that you can use with a clean bonnet that actually takes some swirl marks out and things like that. Some people ask, do you need to buff out a new finish? Well, when you're doing it out on a driveway or in a non-production type setting, you're going to get some kind of orange peel or a roughness to the finish in the clear coat on the and it's not going to be a perfect finish. I've had some trucks that it looked good enough that I said I'm not even going to buff it because it's a lot of work. If you're doing a partial where you're doing a fender or doing a thing, you almost need to buff it because it's going to be so shiny compared to the existing finish. When you buff it, when you sand it and buff it out, it looks more like a factory finish. They're both shiny, but there's a little bit of difference to like that virgin finish and the other. Just got to be really careful. One thing to remember when you're buffing is that when you're going across edges or a sharp edge, that buffing wheel is going to take off a lot more material because of the pressure put on the wheel on that edge than a flat surface. So you got to go really light around all those edges, or let me tell you, you will just take all the paint that you just put on and it'll be on the floor in the buffing. I also would suggest either wear some nasty clothes or an apron. Maybe not a pink apron, but an apron, because when that thing spins, it slings that crap all over the place, and you'll get this lines of buffing compound all over you. If I'm going to do a whole car, then I just dress with clothes that I'm going to wash, and because it will wash out with water. But I mean, you'll be covered in buffing compound. As far as that goes, pretty much that's all the tools you really have to buff correctly. I don't suggest hand buffing. I don't like all that. There is one other thing. If you've got an existing car and you want to try not burning through, they make kind of like an orbital two-handled thing that you can get like at AutoZone. You can use that with like almost a wax, and you don't have as much problem with it burning through if you're afraid of doing that, because you can burn through with one of these. So let's get on with it. Okay, so I've got one of the doors off here, and this door is going to be repainted, so it's no big deal if I do anything to it to damage it. I actually tested it with some of the base coat to see if it matched the color, because it's all going to be sanded down. But we can go ahead and I can buff this real quick and show the difference. You can kind of see a lot of the scratches and mars in this paint finish from 20 years of use, or this may have been repainted, I have no idea. But I'm going to buff it to show you the difference. Okay, so I haven't wet sanded this down because A, I don't care, and B, it wouldn't make much difference. This is an old finish. But I'm going to apply my compound to the surface. And then I'm just going to move it around a little bit, get it spread out on my pad, and then I'm going to buff in kind of a tight circular pattern. Okay, so once I've got it about polished out where I want it, I'm going to take off this bonnet. I'm going to go ahead and put on my finishing bonnet. And we're going to give it our finish buff. Okay, so when you look at it, you can see a big difference in the finish. It's much smoother. I can feel that it's smooth. There was some really deep scratches in here that I can still see, and you might try to wet sand those down, but from this gouge, I can feel that you may be down into clear coat, into the base coat when you hit that. So that's basically going to be your buffing. If you were actually buffing it, and you want to be careful about this edge here. When you're going along these edges, be super careful not to get that buffer on the edge of that. If you get it on the edge, it will burn that clear coat off of a rounded edge. But it did make a big difference. So if you had a vehicle that the clear coat was in decent shape, you could buff it out. As you can tell in this one, it wouldn't do a lot of good for these deep scratches. So this truck, since it's ready to be repainted, then we're good to go. Okay, well, I got stuff all over the front of my shirt. That's my first video on buffing. When I repaint the truck, we're gonna wet sand it down, go through those procedures and buff the whole thing. But that's just kind of a first introduction video to buffing, and I hope you can kind of get what tools you need to get. You need to get a buffer sander, a polisher sander. You can go to any paint supply or TCP Global or eBay and get you a polishing pad kit that has the Velcro on it. I find those to be the easiest to use to take on and off, and you need the foam and you need a finishing bonnet. You need some polishing compound depending on what you're going to polish. It goes a pretty long way, so you could either get a quart or a little bit smaller. You don't need a gallon of it for sure, and you should be in good shape as far as getting going on the buffing part of it. Just really be careful with your finishes that are wow. So be really careful with the finishes, if it's an existing finish, that you don't burn through, because then you'll be really kind of mad because you're going to have to repaint it anyway. This is David from Redneck Garage. I'll catch you later.